Chapter 6. The first Saturday afternoon in May found a busy group of ladies and girls in the big parlor at Broad Acres, which Mrs. Wilson had given up to Red Cross work. Saturday was usually sacred to needle and broom and cookstove in preparation for the quiet, strictly kept Presbyterian Sunday. But today was an exception. A Red Cross box was to be sent off next week, and everything else was put aside to get it ready. Mrs. Wilson was cutting out hospital shirts. "This finishes our last piece of cloth," she said regretfully. "I do wish we had some money." There was an awkward silence. Money had to be mentioned sometimes in a shop, asking Mr. Blair the price of shoes and umbrellas in an apologetic tone. But to wish for it in public and aloud, no one had ever before heard a village lady do such a thing. Miss Fanny Morrison, who had charge of the work, broke the embarrassing silence. "These shirts ain't ready to pack," she said with a frown, as she pushed aside a bundle she had just opened. "I've got to rip 'em and do 'em over. Every seam is crooked or puckered. If you would tell whoever did them," began Mrs. Blair. "Course I can't tell her," said the seamstress, who was supposed to have a tongue as sharp as her needle. "It's Mrs. Tavis. Ain't she doing her best?" With her dim old eyes and trembly old hands. "I can't tell her. It would save me time for her to sit and twirl her thumbs and let me make the shirts instead of unmaking 'em and making 'em over. Well, we've got a lot done, and you girls have certainly worked splendid. I thought you all, Alice and Ruth and Patsy and Mary Spencer and Essie Walpole, the bunch of you would just be a lot of trouble. But you're faithful and painstaking, and you do as good work as anybody." "We like to do it," said Patsy, whose fingers were flying in the effort to finish a sweater. "This will be 6 pairs of socks I've knit," said Alice Blair, "and I thought I'd never get done that first pair." "You've learned how," said her mother. Then she chuckled. "Will says he expects to wake up some night and find me knitting in my sleep." "Ah, dears," Mrs. Spencer said in her gentle, quavering old voice. "This takes me back to the war. We used to gather here, in this very room, to knit socks and make bandages and tear linen sheets and underwear into lint for our poor, dear, wounded soldiers. Those awful days," said Miss Fanny. "I certainly am thankful we are not really in this war. In it with our men and our homes." "I am beginning to feel," Mrs. Wilson said quietly, "that we are in it, and that this is our war. There are Fayette and Jeff and William, and the President's war message, and now the draft. It's awful to think they may make our boys go to foreign parts to fight," groaned Mrs. Blair. "They don't seem to need much making," remarked Mrs. Wilson. "Europe doesn't seem so far off as it used to," said Mrs. Red Mayo Osborne, who had locked herself out of the bookcase for a whole week. "Who'd have thought 3 years ago we'd be giving up our Saturday duties to make things to send to France and Belgium?" "Europe isn't so far off," Mrs. Wilson replied. "The Germans gave us 2 object lessons last year to prove that sending the Deutschland and U-53 to our very harbors, and next thing we know aircraft will cross the ocean." The others laughed at the idea of such a thing. "Well, there are other nearnesses," said Mrs. Wilson. "The ties are tightening among English-speaking people. Didn't it thrill you to read about the stars and stripes floating from the highest tower of the Parliament buildings? The first time a foreign flag was ever displayed there. I didn't care so much about that." Miss Fanny tossed up her chin. She prided herself on being an unreconstructed rebel, and kept a little Confederate flag draped over a chromo of Lee and his generals. But she went on, "It did give me a queer feeling to read about that great service the English had in St. Paul's, to celebrate America's joining in the war. They sang, 'Oh God, our help in ages past,' the very hymn we were singing Sunday morning. We people of the same tongue and blood are getting together," said Mrs. Red Mayo. "I don't see anything good anywhere outside the village," declared Mrs. Walpole. "When my old man comes home and tells the cruel, wicked, dreadful, terrible things," Mrs. Walpole's language was broken out with adjectives like smallpox, "Will Blair reads in his paper, you feel as if the world was upside down, and something mean and awful might even happen here." This was such a wild flight of fancy that everyone laughed. "Why, even during the war," said Mrs. Spencer, "the war that we were in, Bodies of all the men and hearts of all the women and children, even that, my dears, didn't come to the village, except the one raid from Sherman's army marching north. That awful April. I am glad we are shut up here in the safe, quiet little corner, said Mrs. Blair, for, as Mrs. Walthall says, terrible things are happening. Not only factories and munition plants destroyed in the north, but railroad bridges and trestles right here in Virginia. A bridge near Norfolk, a bridge that trains with troops and supplies and munitions have to cross, was saturated with oil and set afire by foreigners and Negroes. Her voice dropped. There is our bridge, began Mrs. Walthall. She was interrupted by a little indignant stir. Mrs. Osborne said crisply, that bridge is just as safe as our own doorsteps. They say, Mrs. Walthall said, that in New York poison has been put in Red Cross bandages and dressings. I declare, I feel like we ought to inspect our things and keep them locked up. Nonsense, Anna, exclaimed Mrs. Red Mayo. Inspect things and lock them up. Whoever locks up anything in the village? Why, we never lock our outside doors, and in summertime they stand wide open every night. Strange and curious and terrible things are happening in other places, said Mrs. Walthall. In other places, Mrs. Osborne repeated, dryly and emphatically. The ladies were so absorbed in work and talk that they did not hear the click of the front gate, and the stumbling and stamping of feet coming up the steps. Susan opened the parlor door. There's some menfolks out here. Miss Agnes, she said to her mistress. They say please they want to see the Red Cross ladies. To see me? Asked Mrs. Wilson. To see the Red Cross ladies. That's what they say, Miss Agnes. Ask them to come in, said Mrs. Wilson. Miss Fanny modestly hid a hospital shirt she was ripping and began to knit a wristlet. Susan opened the door and ushered in 9 old men. They were feeble and broken with years. Years not only of age, but of poverty and many hardships. They shuffled in, some on wooden legs, some dragging paralyzed feet, some supporting rheumatic limbs with canes and crutches. There were palsied arms and more than one empty sleeve. The old fellows came in panting and wheezing from the exertion of climbing the steps. At the door they took off their hats, bearing bald patés and straggling white locks, and stood in line. Mrs. Wilson went forward swiftly and greeted them with gracious courtesy, but they did not respond as friends and neighbors. We came on an errand to you Red Cross ladies, Captain Anderson said formally. We, he straightened his old shoulders, are Confederate veterans. At the words the ladies came to their feet in respect and homage. Confederate veterans, Captain Anderson repeated. The bent, stiff forms stirred with a memory, rather than a reality of soldierly bearing. The bleared, dim old eyes brightened. Their spokesman went on in his thin, quavering voice. Ladies, fair flowers of Virginia womanhood. We, the little remnant surviving of the gallant defenders of our glorious lost cause, greet you. By the noble generosity of the village, funds have been raised for us to attend the reunion at Washington. It is a grand and glorious place to hold the reunion. We are glad and proud that our old comrades are to meet there in the capital they threatened 6 times, by their dauntless and renowned valor, but the streets of which they were never to tread in uniform, and under flag until now, after a half-century of peace. They are to camp in the very shadow of the capital of our glorious and reunited country, and their battle-shattered and death-thinned ranks are to parade before the president, and be addressed by him, the first president since the war, born on the sacred soil of old Virginia, and the greatest president since Washington. 3 cheers for President Wilson. They were given with a will by the thin, cracked old voices. And stammered Captain Anderson. Gettysburg, said old Mr. Tavis in a stage whisper. Yes, Gettysburg, Gettysburg. That comes presently. He mopped his brow with a bandana handkerchief. The president to address us. Yes, yes. No more is needed to make it a grand and perfect occasion, but more is to be added. The veterans in gray and their brethren in blue are to make a pilgrimage to Gettysburg. That was the high water mark of our glorious and unsuccessful war. There is to be erected a monument to our brave comrades, the heroes that fell on that bloody field. I tell you, ladies, we are as glad and proud of it all as if we were going to that reunion ourselves. But you are going, cried Patsy. And now here's war again. We don't count that little skirmish with Spain, but Now the United States is in a real war, and South and North and East and West are standing shoulder to shoulder together. This isn't like the war we fought, a decent war of man against man on the earth God gave them to fight over. This war, it's like nothing that ever was before in civilized times, robbing and burning towns by the hundred, shooting down unarmed people in gangs, killing men with poisonous gases like you would so many rats, sinking ships without giving folks a chance for their lives, dropping bombs from airships on homes and schools and hospitals. It makes our hearts sick for people to suffer such things, and it makes our blood boil for people to do them. So we've talked it over together, we old cons, and we're all of one mind. We want to help the women and children and the pieces of men left by this hellish fighting. So here is the money. Please, ma'am. He held out a purse to Mrs. Wilson that you all so generously raised to send us to the reunion. We bring it to you as our contribution to the Red Cross. Oh, cried Patsy. But you mustn't miss it. The grandest of all reunions. You must go. He shook his head. This is what Marse Robert would do if he was here today, he said simply, looking up now in his old age, as to a beacon, to the hero he had adoringly followed in youth. Mrs. Wilson controlled her voice and spoke. We accept your offering, don't we? She turned to her companions, and every head was bowed. We accept it in the noble spirit in which it is given, a spirit worthy of your peerless leader. And we thank you from our hearts, in the name of suffering humanity, to whose service it is consecrated. But for you to give up the reunion that you've looked forward to, mourned Miss Fanny. The old men glanced at one another with a sort of shy glee. Then Captain Anderson said, "That isn't all. We are going to volunteer. They're going to have that draft and raise soldiers. Folks said at first they just need American dollars and food and steel, but they're calling for soldiers now. And I tell you, they'll need American valor. As long as war is war, they'll want men. The young soldiers, the drafted boys, will do their best, but we are going to write to the president and tell him we are ready to go, and we seasoned old soldiers will show those youngsters what fighting is." While the old heroes were making their offering, Dick Osborne was creeping along the edge of a field near the village, carrying in his arms something bundled up in a newspaper. He scrambled through the churchyard hedge and crept into the woodshed at the back of the church. Now that its winter uses were over, no one else gave the shed a look or a thought, and Dick had hidden here his mining tools and a bundle with something white in it. His garden task was off his hands at last, and he had planned to spend today at the old mine. But Patsy had watched him keenly all the morning, and this afternoon David and Steve were at work in a cornfield near the road. Usually it would be easy enough to elude them, but not today, burdened with the tools he had to carry. And anyway, he had devised a plan to lend interest and excitement to the long, weary way to the mine. In order to carry out his plan and avoid embarrassing questions, he had obtained permission to spend the night with his cousin at the mill. Safe in the shed, he opened the package he had been carrying so carefully and chuckled as he looked at its contents. It was a cow's skull. "Ah, it's a beauty," he said, gazing admiringly at the bleached and whitened old thing. "And when I fix it," he proceeded to fix it by pasting green tissue paper over the eye holes and fastening his flashlight inside. Then he stood back and looked at it. It was as fearful looking as he had hoped it would be. He opened the other package and took out a sheet which he smeared with phosphorus. It was getting dark now. Late enough, Dick thought, for him to venture out. He fastened the tools together with an old chain and slung them over his shoulder. Then he draped the sheet around him and fastened the skull on his head. He crept out of the shed, slipped around the corner of the church, and looked up and down the road. The coast was clear, and he took the road to Redville. For a mile he had it to himself. Then he heard wheels and voices behind him. He hesitated a minute, then prudently withdrew to the wayside. It might be people who would accept him as a ghost, or it might not. It was Mr. Spencer, trotting homeward from the village, with his son Joe. Dick crouched in the bushes. "Wait a minute, Pa," said Joe. "There's something queer in those chinquapin bushes. Something white and light-looking. Let's see what it is. Shh. It's just Gordon Jones' old white cow, replied Mr. Spencer. We haven't time to stop. We're late for supper already. When they were safely out of sight, Dick came back to the highway and hurried along, till he came to the old plank road and the big woods. From here on, there were only a few Negro cabins, and he felt secure in his ghostly array. Isham Baskerville's cabin was dark and seemingly deserted. But the door of the next house was open, and from within came a bright light and loud voices and laughter. Peter Jim Jones was having a frolic. The guests were overflowing on the porch, and the barking of dogs and the squealing of children mingled with the jovial voices of men and women. As Dick stalked down the road toward the cabin, a dog began to bark and then subsided into a whine. One of the Negroes on the porch looked around and caught a glimpse of the white, tall figure. What's dat?" he stammered. "What's what?" Dick took a few steps forward, clanking and rattling his chains, and stood still in an open space, revealed and concealed by the light of a fading young moon. His white drapery glimmered and gleamed with pale phosphorescent light, and the green eyes in the ghastly old skull glared like a demon's. He uttered a sepulchral moan. The Negroes rushed pell-mell into the cabin, tumbling over one another. "A hant! A hant! A hant!" Dick's moan broke into a laugh, but that came to an abrupt end, for a dozen dogs ran to investigate the strange appearance which, after all, had a human scent. Dick in his flowing drapery stood for a moment at a disadvantage, but he jerked up the sheet and gave a kick that sent one cur yelping away. And then he laid about him so vigorously with his bundle of tools that the dogs retreated, yelping and howling, while their masters crouched indoors, shaking with terror. Mightily amused and pleased with himself, Dick went on down the road. He passed the hollow where Solomon Gabe's cabin stood, and came to Mine Creek. He paused to look at his gruesome image in the still, dark water. Then he turned to follow the path to the mine. As he turned, he faced a pile of logs, the ruins of the old blacksmith's hut. It was in shadow except for a ray of moonlight at one side. In that streak of moonshine, there rose, as if the earth had yawned and let forth a demon, a little, dark, bowed figure with a black, evil face. It was horribly contorted, the eyes wide and staring, the lips writhing in terror. For a minute Dick and the fiend-like figure stood silent, face to face. Then the boy stepped back. His foot caught on a root. He stumbled and, with a wild gesture and an awful clanking of chains, fell flat on the ground. A screech quivered through the air, so sudden, so wild and terrified, that it seemed like a live, tormented thing. The dark form crashed through the bushes and was gone. Dick recovered himself in a minute. He scrambled to his feet and, clutching his drapery, ran up the hill toward the old mine. He hurriedly rid himself of his ghostly apparel, took out his flashlight, and threw the skull and the tools into the mine hole. Then, with the sheet bundled under his arm, he sped homeward. As he passed Peter Jim's cabin, he heard fervent prayers and pious groans. The frolic had been turned into a prayer meeting. Dick smiled ruefully. "I don't reckon they were much worse scared than I was," he said to himself. "Who on earth could that have been?"